Hey, and welcome to this week's coaching video for small group leaders at Dayspring. This video you're watching is for off-campus small group leaders who are going to be facilitating and hosting a group after the Sunday service on September 1st, 2013. I'm Brett, and I'm going to be coaching you through this video. Now, if you are an on-campus small group leader at Dayspring, you teach a group that meets on campus on a Sunday morning, this isn't the video for you. You need to head back to the Dayspring group channel on YouTube and find the video that's designed for you. But if you are an off-campus small group leader, or you're going to be hosting or facilitating a small group after the Sunday service on September the 1st, then you're watching the right video. I'm glad you're here. You're going to need a couple of things as we get ready to move through this coaching video together, because what I'm going to do is I'm going to coach you through what you're going to have in front of you as you facilitate that small group, and I'm going to make sure that it's just a little bit easier for you as you host and facilitate that thing. So you're going to need a few things with you as we get ready to move through this time together on this coaching video. Number one, you're going to need about 10 to 15 minutes of uninterrupted time as we go through this together. Secondly, you're going to need a copy of the handout that your group members are going to get on Sunday morning, September the 1st. You should already have a copy of this that's been mailed to you. You're going to need that in front of you. Also, you're going to need something to write with, a pen or a pencil, as you can write some notes on your handout. That way you'll be prepared, again, equipped to facilitate your small group when you guys meet. So if you don't have that handout or you don't have something to write with, go ahead and hit pause, go and grab those things and then come back. If you do have those things with you, then we're ready to go. So let's dive right in. You know, I don't know if you are a fan of Tolkien's work, The Lord of the Rings, but it's a great story. And if you've ever read the story or you've seen the movie, you know that part of what makes his story so great is not just the story itself, which is great, but the cast of characters who make up the story. There are so many endearing characters in The Lord of the Rings, and if you really think through them, you know, you've got Frodo, who is the main character. And if you're not familiar with the story, basically, it's sci-fi, it's fantasy, and it revolves around this time period in this place called Middle-earth. And what's happening is there is a ring that exists, and this ring, the Dark Lord is trying to get possession of this ring, because if he can take possession of this ring, the Dark Lord's basically going to be able to rule Middle-earth, and it's going to be a really, really bad thing if he does that. Well, the ring comes into the possession of this little hobbit named Frodo. His uncle Bilbo is kind of responsible of getting the ring to Frodo, and Frodo is responsible now with this ring, and he comes to find out the fate of the world really rests in this ring, which he now possesses. And Frodo learns that what he needs to do is to take the ring, travel all the way to Mount Doom, and throw the ring into Mount Doom, which is basically like a volcano, and that will destroy the ring, and that will save Middle-earth. Well, The Lord of the Rings is this tale of Frodo, the Hobbit, and his journey to Mount Doom to destroy the ring, and it's this big adventure and all of this. Now, along the way, Frodo is accompanied by many, many people. Many other people come into the story. And that's really what makes the work so great. Not just the story itself, but the cast of characters. You have Frodo the Hobbit. You have Bilbo, his uncle. You have Gandalf, the wise wizard, who's really my personal favorite character of the story. You have the evil players who come into play. You have the Dark Lord himself. You have Gollum, the creepy little, former hobbit or hobbit that is trying to take the ring back, and he almost ruins everything. And then you have other great characters like the human king, Aragorn, the great king who saves the day in many ways. So as you think through this story, if you're familiar with it, if you were to ask people who are fans of Tolkien's work or who've seen the movies maybe, if you were to say who's the significant person of this story, or who's your favorite and the most significant person, well, you're going to probably hear many of those names come out. Certainly Frodo, who's the central character. He's the Hobbit. You also have his uncle, Bilbo, who's a major player, Gandalf. All of these others may get mentioned as the major players and the central parts of the story. What's interesting is that very few will probably mention Sam. Sam, Frodo's best buddy, a fellow Hobbit, who's with him all along the way. And the interesting thing about Sam, he's not the main character. He's a side character. He's a supporting cast member. But were it not for Sam, Frodo's story would not work out right, because at the very end, when Frodo's out of energy and when Frodo's he's all tapped out, it's Sam who carries Frodo up that mountain. So we might say that Sam seems like really an unimportant part of the story, but quite frankly, he's incredibly significant because his story is wrapped up in the story of Frodo, which is the story that counts. Now, here's why I tell you that story. That's a great analogy for this small group lesson, because here's what you're learning in this small group lesson. Here's the overview of this lesson. We all have stories, life stories, individual stories. And quite frankly, all of us want to have a story that matters, don't we? I mean, we want to live a life that matters, a life that is significant. And sometimes it does seem as if this world really doesn't need us in the picture. You know, that if we weren't even around, would it really make a difference? But here's the point, and this is the point of this small group lesson. We live lives of significance, and we live lives that matter when our life story is swallowed up in the greatest story of all, which is the message of the gospel. That when our lives are part of the greater story of Jesus, then we have lives that are significant. And obviously, when I say the story of Jesus, I'm not talking in a fictional sense. I'm talking about the fact that when my life isn't the center part of my own story, that when Jesus is the center of my world, and when he's the center of it all, and that I'm included in that, now I live a life that matters and a life that counts. That's a pretty good summary of this small group discussion that you're going to lead. And I would add this. It's always good, before you facilitate a small group, it's always good that you know the main point of what's going on, that you know where you're trying to lead the discussion and kind of the concluding point of the discussion. It's good for you to know that. And that's really where you're trying to lead people in this. That our lives, if they're really going to matter, if they're really going to be significant, we have to be swallowed up inside the story of Jesus, inside the gospel of Jesus. And if we are inside that circle, then we matter. We really matter because Jesus is the central figure in history, and he's the only one in whom people can find life. So when people believe in him, they find life. They really live. And if we're part of the story that leads people to him, if we're part of the picture that points people to him, then we've lived a life that matters. So that's an overview of your small group lesson. Now that you kind of have the big picture in mind, let's look at the details. Get your handout with you. I'm going to talk you through it talking point by talking point. Starting off in talking point number 1, it just simply leads your group to read John chapter 20, verses 30 and 31, and then to recap what they heard in the Sunday sermon. The reason this passage is the one that you'll read is because you'll see that that's the central part of the Sunday sermon, or that's where the Sunday sermon starts, in John chapter 20, where John tells us, he says, I've written this gospel, the gospel of John, I've written it so that you may believe, and that in believing you may have life. So you'll recap those verses. Everybody should be familiar with it if they were in the church service. And then you'll give people a chance to talk about what they heard, what they learned, what's on their mind as a result of being in the worship service. And I would encourage you to do this as a small group leader and facilitator. When you're in the Sunday service, really pay attention, but take notes. Use your note sheet. Take some notes, because you'll notice that the handout says, point 1, read this passage, then talk about what you remember from Sunday's sermon, and to use your notes if you took any. Well, as the leader, why don't you lead the way in that? You can take some notes, and that'll give you something to discuss. So that's how you start off the small group lesson. That's how you always start your off-campus small group lesson. And that'll get everybody to talking and remembering kind of where they were when they heard the message. Now, talking point number 2, bullet point number 2. It says on Sunday we were introduced to the prologue of John's gospel. And then the handout tells you to read several verses from the prologue of John's gospel. Those verses should sound familiar because they'll be preached about in the Sunday sermon. Okay, so again, this is a little bit of a recap what you're doing here. And there's a question there in discussion point number 2 that asks the question, who is John talking about when he uses the phrase, the Word? When John talks about the Word, who's he talking about? Well, that should be really clear in light of the sermon, but the answer obviously is Jesus. John uses this word, the Word, to reference Jesus, who is both the logic and the logistics of God. He's the explanation of God. So that's bullet point number 2 there. And again, you're getting people in the mode of what you heard Sunday and what you learned. And by the way, those verses you read in point number 2, you'll hear it in the sermon. This is the prologue of John's gospel. He's introducing everyone to Jesus, and he's making it clear, as your discussion guide guides you there. He's making it clear. I'm writing about Jesus. He is the one and only. He is the central figure of history. And John the Apostle wants us to know. He wants us to notice Jesus, to pay attention to Jesus, to hear what Jesus said, to see what Jesus did, so that we will believe in Jesus. It's all about Jesus. Now, that leads us to discussion point number 3, verses 6 through 11 of John chapter 1. This is your primary text for your small group lesson, John chapter 1, verses 6 through 11. Now, this is part of the prologue of John's gospel. However, these verses 6 through 11, they will not get touched upon in the Sunday sermon. So while the prologue in general is the bulk of the Sunday sermon, verses 6 through 11 aren't included. So you can really see how this fits together with what everybody's going to be hearing. So in bullet point number 3, you just read those verses. John chapter 1, verses 6 through 11. Now, you'll notice as you look over those verses 6 through 11 actually aren't about Jesus. They're about John the Baptist. John the Apostle, in his prologue, starts writing about John the Baptist. And by the way, those two Johns aren't one and the same. Okay, so if that comes up in your small group discussion, you know the answer. John, who's writing the gospel, is not John the Baptist, who's being spoken of here in verses 6 through 11. So, think about this. In John's prologue to his gospel, which is intended to point us straight to Jesus, the gospel message, the story of Jesus, and again, not story in a fictional sense, but the life and times of Jesus and what he did and what he said and who he is, more importantly. John, who's pointing us there into that big circle of Jesus, all of a sudden starts talking about somebody else, John the Baptist. Now, bullet point number 4 on your discussion guide here, look at this. Here's the question you're going to pose. If John's gospel is supposed to point our hearts to Jesus, then why do you suppose he starts talking about John the Baptist? That's the question you're going to ask. Now, some folks may not actually have an answer to that. That may be more of a contemplative question. So when you ask it, people may answer, they may not answer. Give people a chance to think about it. Give them a chance to answer it if they have a question. But here's pretty much where you're going with this, okay? So you'll kind of know where this is going. It's almost like saying, if the Lord of the Rings is about Frodo, then why are we talking about Sam? Do you see where this is headed here? The message of Jesus, there are other names and other faces who come into this circle. There are other players, if you will, other characters, supporting characters, who are important to the overall message of the gospel. So that's really what you're getting at here in bullet point number 4. If John's just wanting to introduce us to Jesus and make sure we know all about Jesus and believe in Jesus, why is he talking about John the Baptist? Well, this is where you're headed, because John the Baptist is actually important to the message. John the Baptist is important to the overall story. Now that leads us into bullet point number 5 here. It says, in truth, John the Baptist was quite significant. And as you re-examine verses 6 through 11, so have everybody read these verses again. Maybe you read them out loud. As you re-examine verses 6 through 11, talk about what it was that gave John the Baptist importance and significance. According to these verses, what made him important? What made him significant? And again, you already know where we're going with this answer, but 2 specific things that you can point out. Number 1, according to these verses, he's important because God himself sent John. John was where he was when he was because God Almighty sent him. That makes him important, wouldn't you agree? The second answer, part of the answer to that question, why was John the Baptist important? What gave him significance? The second part is that God himself gave John a task, a role, a mission. So think about it. John the Baptist was sent by God and given by God a specific task. What could be more important, right? To have God send you with a specific mission. The reality is that John the Baptist and the part that he played in the life of Jesus was indeed very important. And by the way, if you want to cross-reference, just to kind of throw in here, if you'll look in Matthew chapter 11, if you want to read some of Jesus' own words about John the Baptist, scan over Matthew 11 and read what Jesus says about John the Baptist, and you'll discover, again, John had an important part to play in the telling out of the gospel of Jesus. In the great narrative of the life and times of Jesus, John the Baptist was a supporting cast member, and Jesus says he was very important as such. Okay, so this is where you are so far in the handout. We move into bullet point number 6. Look at this. It says the reality is that our significance, like John the Baptist's, come from the fact that God himself has appointed us to make sure that people notice Jesus. Look at that statement again. Our significance, just like John the Baptist's, our significance comes from the fact that God himself has appointed us to make sure that people know about Jesus. So, if God appoints someone and puts them in this world with the task of making sure that people see the great narrative of the gospel and understand it and see it and hear it, that people know about Jesus, then we're important, even as a supporting cast member. That's what this small group lesson is all about. You'll notice that bullet point number 6 eventually leads you to John chapter 3, verses 25 through 30. You'll have somebody read that, or you can read that, but basically that's John the Baptist's perspective on being a supporting cast member. That's John the Baptist's perspective on realizing that he plays second fiddle. And he says, you know what? That's great, because I don't want the story to be all about me. This isn't about my life story. This is about Jesus' life story. And if I'm part of that life story, then I matter. I have significance in this life. So that's where you're going with basically the teaching portion of this small group lesson. You'll notice on bullet point number 7, your group has some interactive things to do here. There are 4 Bible verses or Bible sections of the Bible that you're going to read together. Passages, that's the word I'm looking for. 4 different Bible passages that your group will read one at a time. And here's what your group needs to do. After each passage is read, have everyone write out just one thought, one phrase, one word even, relative to the discussion you've had so far about playing second fiddle to Jesus, about being a supporting cast member in the story that counts. Have everybody just write one phrase. So as they read the Philippians 2 passage, write down one phrase as it relates to what you're learning. As they read the 1 Peter passage, write down one phrase. So at the end of discussion point number 7, everybody in the group should have written down 4 things. Then, discussion point number 8, taking those 4 things into consideration, you're going to complete that statement there at bullet point number 8, which says, utilizing the 4 things you just wrote, complete this sentence. To live out my role as a witness to Jesus, I must blank. So everybody's going to fill that in. And as you talk about John the Baptist's perspective and the way that he embraced the role of being a supporting cast member. I mean, he was fine being Sam of the story. He didn't have to be Frodo. He didn't have to be the main character. He knew that just being in the story itself made him matter. And he embraced that role as we see there in that John chapter 3 passage. And one thing that you may want to do as the small group facilitator, utilizing our devotional book, Praying Through the Gospel of John, if you look on page 34, here's something, just jot that down. Page 34 and 35, the last 2 paragraphs there. It says something about John and how he embraced his role as a supporting cast member. And I'll just read it to you. Listen to this. It says, John the Baptist's simplicity and humility shine out from the pages of Scripture. He was the same age as Jesus. He had a divine calling on his life, and everyone knew it from his history. After all, John's mother had been barren, and his father was struck mute for doubting the angel's words. John the Baptist had sacrificed almost everything to be God's messenger. He was persecuted, humiliated, and even imprisoned. In other words, he had every reason to be proud, even to put himself first. But instead, John knew that his place was behind Jesus. He was born to prepare the way, not to pretend to be the way. And when the time came for Jesus' ministry to begin, John did not hesitate to usher in that world-changing moment. Some of John's followers tried to bait his pride by telling John that Jesus was getting more attention. But again, John insisted that he was sent to get things ready for the coming Christ. He was like the best man at the wedding, happy to be there and to do his part. You may read that. It's found again in pages 34 and 35 of our book, the middle paragraph and then the paragraph that bleeds into page 35. That may be helpful as you facilitate. It's actually not part of your daily readings, so you're moving ahead a little bit, but it sure does fit in with what we're talking about. That as we live our lives, we must become less and he must become more, which, by the way, you'll notice that's bullet point number 9. You're going to finish by memorizing your memory verse, which is John 3, verse 30. He must become greater, I must become less. So hopefully this is going to help you as you facilitate your small group guide and your small group meeting. Thanks for being here and following along on the coaching tips. I hope and pray that you have a great small group meeting. I hope and pray that it sticks with your group, that our lives matter because we're swallowed up in the greater story of Jesus. May we become less and may he become greater. Hey, God bless you.
Hallelujah, glorious redemption, holy restoration, love has come to